Veda Austin joins in the calm. You guys are gonna flip out with this episode. It is so good. Such a deep dive into so many different areas. Veda is a leading water expert. She's a water researcher, a photographer, an artist, an author, and international speaker. Veda's focus is the state between water and ice, specifically water's consciousness within these states. In this episode, she's going to share a very in-depth presentation demonstrating the breadth of her work. So I am not going to edit any of this. It's a 2.5-hour presentation. I want you to come back to it. I'm going to link the YouTube file so you can watch the video, see the presentation and the images Veda shares in this conversation. You can also watch the video in full on Spotify. You guys, it's just so incredible when you start to open up the conversation about what's possible with water as our teacher, water's relationship, water's healing ability, and her own story. I mean, you're really going to be blown away. I've been familiar with Veda's work kind of obsessively for a few years now. And, just really admiring it as an art form, and then more so realizing the depth of what she's presenting and what she's connecting us to. And so being in conversation with her and getting to know her now and call her a friend, it has been deeply impactful in my life. She's brought pieces of knowledge to my life that have really closed the gap on so many questions and personal experiences I've had as a seer and shaman. It's the way we understand language, the way we move in time and space, and also communicate on the energy grids across the entire universe. Water informs all of that. And Veda says, through the study of water, many of her biggest questions have begun to be answered. I feel the same. I'm not even going to continue to detail this episode. I really want you guys to just dive in. Check out these show notes for all the amazing ways to connect with Veda, as well as the resources mentioned in this episode. Welcome to In the Calm. I'm your host, Georgiana Alexander. Veda Austin, so thrilled to have you here. I have been such a huge fan of your work and your journey, bringing together your research, your art, and this merge of consciousness. I know everyone's heard about you, but you're a researcher, a speaker, a mother, and an artist, an author. You have an upcoming book that we're going to dive into a little bit as well. It's just such an honor to have you on. Your entire perspective of life and consciousness and intelligence and water and all the work that you've done and commitment you've put into this is just incredible. So thank you so much for being here.
Well, it's absolutely my pleasure. And I'm sure there's lots of people that haven't heard of me, actually. It's so sweet when people say that, but there's always people that don't know who the heck I am. So that's always kind of fun to share a little bit about what I do and why people might be interested in my work as well. So I'm more than happy to do that.
I think it would be incredible to start for everyone listening, if you wouldn't mind sharing your story of how water found you on your healing journey.
I had a really remarkable healing experience with water quite some years ago now. And it made me very, very curious about the question, what is water? And that is something that has guided me on the last 10 years of water research. So what happened was that many years ago, over 20 years ago, I was in a horrendous car accident. I was the passenger, and we went under a 7-ton truck, rolled twice, the car started to spark, and the driver died immediately. And the car was rolled on its side, and I was wearing a seatbelt, and the seatbelt crushed most of my internal organs and left scar tissue on my small bowel over the course of several months. And that was from the internal bleeding. The scar tissue, as it grew on my small bowel, prevented any food being able to properly be digested. And so every time I would try to eat food, I would end up vomiting and feeling like I was literally in labor. That's how painful it was.
Wow.
I've had children, so I can genuinely say that's what it felt like every day. Like, it sucked big time. Sometimes I actually think back to that year and this very, I was going to say slow, but actually it was a very quick kind of downgrade from being able to eat to suddenly really only having fluid, soups and things. Eventually, after a year, I had bowel surgery, and that made a difference. But even where they tied the bowel and sewed the bowel together, and we had a lot of bowel, so they can actually take quite a bit out and put it back together. But where it was sewed together, there was scar tissue that grew there, and that also then created the same problem. So over the course of the 20 years, I had 8 surgeries, and most of them were for bowel surgery. And one was to put a big metal plate in my collarbone because my collarbone was broken from the impact. And the rest were for endometriosis. 3 doctors actually had told me, because of all of these issues in areas of my reproductive organs as well, and with endometriosis on top of that.
Of everything else, right?
Yeah, everything.
Mhm.
I said I would never be able to conceive or have children. And what I did with that information, even though it came from 3 different people, was that I put it on the shelf of things that are just there. It's not necessarily my truth, but
Mhm.
that's something some people have thought. I didn't take it to heart, but I didn't disregard it. I just put it on the shelf. So in the end, I had 3 children for every doctor that told me that I couldn't.
I love that.
And I did my best on what to do, but I didn't do it in defiance. Every single one was a miracle. I got to this point where on my 8th surgery, where they put a stent in my bowel, I remember having a bunch of doctors standing around me when I came around from the anesthetic, and they were looking at me very concerned, and they said, "Well, you haven't recovered well." And I'm like, "Well, that's a great way to wake up."
Yeah.
And they said, "You have showers of blood clots in your lungs." I'm like, "God, what? I went in for bowel surgery and now I have this issue." And they wanted me to be on warfarin, which is a blood thinner. It also doubles as a rat poison. And I thought, firstly, I was too young. I was really in my very, very early 20s and young, fit, healthy. I was vegetarian, since I was 8. I've never drunk. I've never smoked. I've never done drugs. I've never smoked a cigarette, all of those things. And I'm like, come on, body, like what's going on? But then when you've had 8 surgeries and that much anesthetic and your body's really gone through the ringer, these things can happen, I suppose. I took warfarin for a few months, and after I got a clean bill of health, there were no more clots in my lungs. The doctor was very keen for me to continue on with the warfarin, potentially for the rest of my life because it had happened and they were concerned. And that didn't resonate in the slightest bit for me, and I didn't want to do that. And I believe we should all have a choice as to what we do with our bodies and what we put in it, or don't. And so I made my own personal decision that I trusted that my body knew how to heal itself and to do that naturally. And so I decided to do that, and that's what I did. And I ate well, I looked after myself and all these things. But I ended up speaking to a friend who is a medical doctor and also an Ayurvedic practitioner. And he said to me, off the record, if you can find emphasis on natural, a natural alkaline water, that might help to stabilize your body. And so without going into all of the medical jargon that he talked to me about the rouleaus and how they stick together and how you really want your blood cells to be moving freely, not kind of coming together in a scrum. Part of that is about making sure that your blood alkalinity doesn't alter. And so I have to really add this. Sometimes people talk like alkaline water is going to just suddenly make you more alkaline. Or your blood pH, your body wants that blood pH to remain at, I think it's 7.35 consistently. It absolutely does the most amazing job. It takes something as severe as blood clots for any change to happen there. And one slight little downgrade in that pH can make someone very, very sick. but your body knows exactly well how to keep and maintain that pH. So in my situation, the rouleaus had started to happen, which are like when cells start to clump together rather than move around freely. And that tends to be when your pH starts to go down a tiny bit. So that's what had happened to my body, which is why he was suggesting I maybe try a more alkaline water to help to stabilize my body. So I thought, wow, just drinking water, that sounds easy. And in New Zealand, our pH of our rainwater is generally around over a 7. So anything alkaline is above a 7.
Mhm.
Distilled water is a 7, and anything under that is considered acidic. So I went on this journey to try lots and lots of different alkaline spring waters of New Zealand. I did 2-week trials. I didn't change my skincare or diet or anything specific because I really wanted to be the guinea pig of my own health, I guess. And other than feeling hydrated, I didn't notice anything much going on until one day a client of mine, because I had a wellness center by that time, and she knew what I was doing, and she said, "Look, I know this old guy. He's got his own private water source. He's only giving this water to cancer patients, and it's a spring water, and its pH is 9.9
Wow.
out of the ground." And I'm like, wow, that's the highest I've ever heard of in New Zealand. And so I went to see him. He gave a month's worth of water to try. I was doing this as if I was working with a medicine for all the waters I tried. So I would drink a liter in the morning for at least half an hour to an hour before eating. Because if you're going to drink a naturally alkaline water, you need it to be either side of food. You don't want to drink it with food because it's alkaline. Your stomach's using all its natural acids to break down food as you're eating. So it doesn't make sense to drink alkaline water with it. Kind of defies the purpose, really. And then in the evening, about an hour after I'd eaten. And that's what was my protocol. And so after doing that for 3 days, I noticed a really big change and improvement in bowel motions, which a lot of people don't really like talking about, but it's such an indicator of our internal health. There's all kinds of people in the world.
I find it fascinating. Yeah. Our
Yeah.
bowels, it's the first place to check when you want to see how things are going.
And it definitely will tell you some stuff because there are so many people, that are dehydrated and wondering why they are sitting on the toilet for an hour trying to push out a pebble.
Mhm.
And that's it. And we're such a dehydrated kind of society in the West quite often, which is surprising, right? Because, we have so much water available. And yet I've found that there are literally people out there that never drink water.
Have barely ever drank it. I've talked to some in wellness centers as well, where they would have a conversation wondering why their health was failing and all they drink are diet sodas. And I'm like, how about you just trade that out for water? And it was just mind blowing to them. Yeah, it's fascinating.
And it's hard to believe, but it's actually very, very real. I've been invited to speak at a colon therapy, what's it called?
The colonics.
Colonics, yeah.
Yes.
And there's a group of people that do colonics, and it's a conference in Australia, and I'm invited to speak. And I spoke to this lady who invited me, and she told me something I've never heard of before. And until I saw this, I thought it was not real. I'm like, no way. So she said that's come a long way to how they observe, the waste that comes out of the body. And so she said, usually there's like a see-through tube for the most part. They
Yeah.
see all of the stool and everything going through. And now they have another way where they really want to look in what's coming out to see what's going on for people. And so she works with a lot of Aborigine people, and they believe that there is this really deep connection, no matter what is in or coming out of the body, to their kind of ancestral heritages or things like this. And there's a kind of memory. And even not only in urine, which you could imagine because it's so watery, but also in stool. And I'm like, I hadn't really kind of thought about that. And so she said, yeah, it's true. She said she's got a gallery of photos of that look like things. And I'm like, it can't be real. And she has this one, which I swear to God, it's like this kangaroo. And I'm like, you're kidding me. You kidding me. I can't believe you. But like, she sent me the picture and I'm like, no way. That really does look like a kangaroo. And it's kind of gross because you're looking at poo. But I'm like, wow, I can
Yeah.
send you a picture if you really want
No,
to
send it. I mean, I find it fascinating because, again, and we're going to get into this in a minute, but the consciousness of water and what you've learned about that. And then you can apply that to everything. I mean, and now we're talking about poo and the consciousness of poo, like what comes through. It does. It literally, she's showing me a photo, and there's literally a photo of a kangaroo kind of standing and staring.
It's kind of nuts.
Incredible.
It's amazing. So then you kind of, out of just pure curiosity, you kind of like, well, what else has she got?
Yeah.
But then, I mean, that we've really kind of veered off track there. I mean, I didn't know any of that. So people are so fascinating, the areas that we take things. And clearly I've gone in the direction of water. And so I noticed an improvement there.
Maybe
And
nicer for you to go in water than poo. And maybe it was your water was your calling, poo is hers.
yeah. Yeah. And I mean, ultimately, colonics are so good to help just to move all of that stagnant waste away.
Mm-hmm.
And so many people are not eating properly. But even people that are trying to get pregnant, interestingly, one a really great thing to do is to go and have a colonic or two to help get that body moving and get that waste out so that, you're preparing for your body for lives. You don't want to be backed up to high heaven. So
No room for anything else.
let's move on to water. So after about day 10, I noticed all these bumps coming up along my arm and jaw that were super painful. And I knew my body was purging, but I didn't know what it was. There was one area that was so angry, and I ended up getting some tweezers, and it's like it felt sharp. It felt literally, I felt like there was something there. And I ended up pulling out this little piece of green glass. And I'm like, what's going on? And in between day 10 and 12, with the help of tweezers and a friend, we pulled out 27 bits of green glass out of my arm and jaw. It seems very strange that there would be all this green glass in me, but 20 years prior, that car accident, the guy who died owned a nightclub, and in the back of the car were crates of Steinlager beer, and those bottles are green. When the car rolled, I must have automatically put my right arm over my face, and that side of my body got that glass, and the other side got more windscreen. I knew that this is tiny shards of glass that had been embedded in my body for years and years and years. And then I'm like, well, how can this water be so different? It's the only thing I've done different. How can it purge, glass that's been embedded in my body so long that I didn't even know was there? Like, what's going on? I did something similar to my dad. My dad is quite a well-known guy in New Zealand. His name's Bill Hohepa. He's a Maori fisherman. He makes loads of videos about fishing and stuff. I gave him some to see what would happen to him, because he used to go fishing a lot. He'd often have fish injuries. So we're like the spike of the fish fins, one of them particularly had gone between his knuckles, and he thought he'd got most of it out, but he always had a little kind of scar and a little bit of a black spot there. So when he started to drink the water, it had almost become fossilized by then. The extra bit he didn't realize he had missed of fish fin, started to make its way out from between his.
Wow.
And so not only that, he started to lose some weight, and that was interesting. And he's always looking for that. When I started giving it to people in my wellness center, I tracked their progress. I did 8-week trials for each person over 2 years. And I did that for lots of people. And what we noticed was everyone's energy improved. So for like an athlete, that incremental extra bit of energy can make a massive difference. But everybody's eyesight improved, which was interesting. One person's had to change the prescription on her glasses because her eyesight had improved so much. And if you consider that our eye lens is 99% water, so we actually literally see everything through the lens of water. That's really interesting. And then apparently one of the reasons, although not the only reason, but one of the reasons that we begin to lose our eyesight as we age is that our eye lens is like I mentioned, one of the highest sources of fourth phase water. Fourth phase water essentially is water that absorbs more light. It has a negative charge. It has more viscosity. So if you've ever seen how sensitive your eye lens is, and it's kind of also like got a film on it, and it's like a gel almost. It's a wonderful description and a visual of fourth phase water. It has a lattice-like order, and so your body kind of is very intelligent in the way that it processes. And so, to keep your heart alive and to keep everything else working efficiently, it will pull from that highest source of structured water in your body, and to keep everything else going, because it's better that you see not so good than die and your heart fail or this organ or that organ. So it slowly starts to deplete your eye lens and to deplete from that fourth phase water in your eyes. Drinking quality water can really help improve that. And I think that that's one of the reasons why people's eyesight was improving. It's written, my friend, I don't normally talk, I don't normally have books handy, but my friend, Dr. Carly Nuday, wrote this book called Water Codes, and she talks about that and many other things in her book. I actually wrote a chapter in it as well.
Oh, that's incredible. I'll link it in the show notes too for everyone listening so that way you can access it as well.
Yeah, she goes into a lot of different areas. Anyway, so that was interesting. And then one person who had stage 4 cancer wanted to try to heal naturally before going down the chemo track. So he decided to do a 27-day water fast. So that's drinking water only, no food, which is a really big commitment.
That's huge.
Huge. And so he was drinking my water, the water I was giving him from the spring. And I used to call it my water because I had such a kind of connection to it. I had so much gratitude for the fact that it was, healing me, and not just healing me. I think it's because of my introduction to that water that it really, I began to form what I would term now as relationship with water, and to be in right relationship with it, because I was able to go and collect it myself and see the land for where it ran underneath and have some connection to that. Also, I noticed it improved my skin. So I started to look a lot younger after drinking it all the time for a year. And people would comment. And so, you look at your face every day and when things are improving.
Yeah.
I'm like, well, this is amazing. Like, what makes it so different? Right.
Right.
The guy who was the cancer guy, so he, after 2 weeks after having finished that fast, he did all the internal work as well, which plays a huge role in this. So I'm not saying it was just the water, but they couldn't find any trace of cancer in his body. And I know he's still okay. Then that wasn't the only case. So I went on this mission, like, what makes this water so different? Why did my body respond differently to it than other waters I'd been trying? You go straight away to an analysis, because I'm a researcher, but I'm multi kind of faceted, as we all are, and I have interests in a lot of different areas. I like science. I'm an artist as well. Worked professionally as an oil painter for about 15 years. And I see the world in a very artistic way. And also I'm very spiritual and very interested in the areas of spirit and consciousness and intuition. And I think when you overlay science, real science, true science, and art and consciousness, and they overlap and they overlay, then you have a truth. And
beautiful.
Thank you. And so, I was like, okay, if we look at an analysis here, what will I find? So you see, okay, it's got XYZ amount of TDS, total dissolved solids, and It's got bicarb, which is giving some of its alkalinity. It's got X and this and this and that, right? And I'm like, okay, well, it could be this. Maybe it's the pH. Maybe it's this. But none of that felt quite enough for it to be doing what it was doing. You look around the world and look at these healing waters or holy waters, and one of the things that makes them different than other waters generally, but not always, but generally, is that they have dissolved hydrogen. They have hydrogen within, quite a large amount of dissolved hydrogen. So I tested with this water for that, and it had a small amount, but not a lot. And I'm like, what's going on? And then I looked at Tesla, and I'm like, well, he says, if you want to know the secrets to the universe, look at energy, frequency, and vibration. And I'm like, how can I look at energy, frequency, and vibration in this water? What would be a way to do that? And I thought, well, maybe we look a little further. And so as I'm looking at the analysis, I'm like looking at all of the things. I realize I'm looking at water's holding. I'm not looking at anything about the water itself. All I'm looking is what's in the water. What do I actually know about water? And that's when I asked, well, what is water? And of course, you could be given the scientific molecular composition. Okay, it's 2 parts hydrogen, it's 1 big oxygen. I'm like, yeah, well, that doesn't tell me anything much. But when you start looking at hydrogen and then you start looking at oxygen and you realize that we're looking at these gases, right, that create a liquid. How does that make sense? And so then when you look at the 2 hydrogen from a different perspective, they're these 2 small hydrogens in the mode of levity, and they're feminine. And you have 1 large oxygen, which is in the mode of gravity, and it's masculine. And together, all of them come together to create liquid water on Earth in balance. And I think that that's really special. And so I began researching about people that I thought might know something about this. And so I, of course, looked at Emoto's work. Although Masaru Emoto wasn't embraced at all by the scientific community, his work, and that is because he openly says that he cherry-picked his photos to show and display what he was trying to say about water. And that is that water is able to absorb information and share information back through images that look somewhat like crystal, like snowflakes, or quite a bit like snowflakes. His work was very contrasting. It was, how will water, when he would flash freeze it and photograph it through a microscope, after it had been influenced by, for example, the word love or the word hate. And so when he brought this out to the world, he displayed what he was trying to say in very big contrasts. And people are almost addicted to seeing the best and worst of things. It's actually fascinating when you start doing that, because I'm very interested in a lot of the stuff in between, because water is involved in everything, not just the best and the worst, but all the everyday stuff too.
Right.
But that's not to take away from what Emoto brought to the world, and that is that people started identifying themselves as bodies of water. They could see, yes, okay, not just by volume, but by molecular count, we're 99% water. There are more water molecules in our bodies than stars in the Milky Way. When we cut, we leak. When we're emotional, we leak. When we sweat, we're leaking. When we go to the bathroom, we leak. And there are a number of other things that happen where we leak, including how we are conceived through fluids, which is remarkable. These intelligent fluids, they come together to create life. These areas sort of suggests, oh, well, yes, I am a body of water, and I am sensitive to thoughts. I'm sensitive to my environment. I'm sensitive to words, and look what he's saying is happening with water. So that was, I think, one of the great gifts that Emoto gave.
That was really the entry point with Emoto's work from my awareness of water and the way that we speak. And it really clicked. I had awareness of language of self. And why would I speak this way to myself? Why would I think this way to myself? Even early on, I would catch certain thoughts and recognize, I think these are cultural things. These aren't my things. And ask myself why, So I was very curious about that relationship. And so when I saw Dr. Emoto's work, of course, I got the book and everything. I later tattooed the words love and gratitude. I have different words that I tattooed. I don't think at that age, I was quite young, I didn't necessarily consider, oh, I'm tattooing the word for myself with the intention that that impacts me, but I'm also putting the ink into my system to have to filter. But but the theory was there that I really took that as awareness and stepping into more mindfulness in my daily life practices by using the words for myself, my water, my food, and slowing down. So I think it was, however contrasting his work may have been, I think it opened the eyes of a lot of people as it did myself, for those of us that were aware. So that's really interesting.
Mm. Yeah, and that's what I mean. He really was a pioneer in that way because it enabled people to be much more open to my work because they've already seen his work, although my work is quite different.
Mhm.
He was using a microscope and I use my iPhone to take photos and anyone can do it. So the second person who really, really inspired me on multiple fronts, actually, his name is Laurent Costa. And he wrote a book called Journey into the Heart of Water. And he has this lovely quote that goes something like, water opens its heart to those that love it.
Mm.
And so he worked in a similar way to Emoto in that he was taking microscopic photographs of water after flash freezing it. But rather than experiment on water, he believes that water is his spiritual teacher. And why would he experiment on your spiritual teacher? That doesn't make any sense whatsoever. Because he didn't see water as being something that was just water. I think what he was seeing was that water is far more than that, and that there was a communication that was happening. And the way he approached it was to be much more of an observer than a participant and an influencer, if you will. He wanted to just see what water would show him. Often we can't help but inspire water, which is a word I prefer than influence if I can use it. And he would sometimes just naturally smile at the water before he'd freeze it. And he was literally, as well as getting beautiful geometries like Emoto did, he was getting smiley faces back at him in the crystallography. He was seeing hearts, he was seeing fish, he was seeing imagery. And there's a really big difference between geometries and art. Now, geometries, of course, you can say are art. I'm not saying they're not. Everything can be art. But it's quite different in the sense that when we go to an art gallery, we are literally looking at unique pieces of art that people have designed that generally can be it can be so varied. You really can't generalize anything really with art, but it might be an impression of a field or a sea scene or something like that, or it might be very abstract. We have these different styles of art. And we go there and we see the picture, but one of the things that makes art most interesting is when we get to know about the artist and what inspired them to paint this picture. Art tends to come from where there's nothing and then there's something. Anyone that's ever drawn anything knows that you start with a blank piece of paper and then you draw something, and then that dot leads to something. Art kind of tends to come from an inspired place. I see that water was designing artistically as if it was an artist. And when I saw Laurent's pictures, of which I can show you in a minute, I was just blown away. So then the third person who inspired me, his name was Thomas Hieronymus. And as I've recently been researching more about him, he was a pretty brilliant guy, and he was talking about scalar waves a long, long time ago. He made a very interesting observation that when he went into a Parisian meat market on a very cold day, he observed that the freshly placed organs of an animal appeared to be affecting the way the frost froze on the glass behind where they were placed. For example, the frost would freeze into the shape of a liver organ or a heart organ above either. He put that down to the fact that there was water in the blood and there seemed to be some kind of life force energy still emanating out of these organs. He put that down to the water. And each organ of an animal or a person has something called a sonic signature. So that sonic signature in a rudimentary way is kind of like a cymatic imprint that holds the information of the form, the function, and the shape of the organ. So these organs were fresh. The blood was still, it hadn't coagulated or anything. It was still fresh. So the water in the blood, he believed, was sharing the sonic signature information to the water in the air, of which we tend not to talk about very much because we can't see it. And then that froze into the form of that blueprint of the organ on the glass when it hit it. What interested me so much about that and that concept was that firstly, he was seeing it with his naked eye. He wasn't having to use a microscope, because 10 years ago, I didn't have a microscope. And I'd been doing all kinds of other stuff, including having children. And so I was like, well, I have a petri dish because I was researching something else. And the secret seems to be where the unseen becomes seen in the freezing. So the commonality was in the freezing. And so I thought, well, if I take a bit of everybody's stuff and I just try this, let's do this. So I thought, I'm going to think of something, project a thought into the water, and then I'm going to freeze it in my freezer. Very basic thought. No, not a lot else of thought went into that. So I was holding my petri dish of water and I noticed there was some fluff floating around in it. So I was like, oh my God. So I put my hand in and took out the fluff, consciously thinking, I wonder if my hand will have any impact on the water's memory. And I didn't know if water really had memory. I'd only seen and read about stuff. But if you can do something yourself, I always recommend you do that, because then you can really know. I was watching a YouTube thing the other day and someone said, you can only believe what you don't know. And I thought that was really interesting.
Mm-hmm. Very true. Very, very relevant.
Yes.
In today's
world.
environment, yes.
And probably quite a lot of hundreds of years as well of that. So, I thought, okay, well, I am going to put it into the freezer with the peas and the broccoli and everything else, and I'm going to just see what happens. And because I thought, well, that thought's good enough, that thought of, oh, I wonder if my hand will impact the water. So I basically forgot about it and came back to it hours later. Took it out of the freezer, held it up to the light, took a photo on my iPhone, and that photo has launched now, just clicked over 40,000 photos of water responding in the most remarkably intelligent ways. The photo was of a hand in the ice. The water had used its building blocks of ice to design an image that represented and looked just like the X-ray of my hand. And for example, people might think, yeah, well, maybe she just thinks it kind of looks like a hand, and maybe she kind of thinks that those images kind of look like things. But we've done a study because Dr. Jerry Pollack has been helping me along this journey when I started sharing my work with him after I've been working on it for about a year or so. The next picture I ever took, because I thought, well, that's one. You can't just work off one. You got to see some consistency.
Right. How incredible that the X-ray of your hand. I mean, you didn't even know what you were expecting, and then you're like, well, okay, my hand's in the water, and then it's the image of your hand.
Well, it was also huge because my petri dishes are 10 centimeters in diameter. And so it's kind of the size of my hand. So half of that is quite large. It's macroscopically huge. That was really interesting. So then I showed my son the picture on my phone, and he didn't even know what I'd done. And he agreed that it looked like the X-ray of a hand. And so then I took some seawater because I thought, well, if any water is naturally informed, maybe it would be seawater. I froze a thin layer of that because seawater is salty, so takes longer to freeze, so I only use a thin amount. And I got this incredible fish with fins and gills and the shape and the tail and this perfectly round eye. And then that's really when my freezer became my most used household appliance. And I just did this with everything I could find, any kind of inspiring influence I could find. And I got amazing pictures. But there was a point where I stopped freezing water solid. And that was after about a year of doing it, when I began to understand about the new science of water this was around also the time I became familiar with Jerry Pollack and also started sending him my work and took his suggestions to heart, of which I'll share in just a second. But I began to understand that this fourth phase water that I mentioned earlier, it has unique properties. So there is a liquid, solid, gas, and then a type of gel or plasma. And that gel or type or plasma type fourth phase water has a negative charge. It's more viscous. It has a slightly higher pH and it absorbs more light, basically. And so our body converts H2O into H3O2, which is also fourth phase water. It has an extra oxygen and hydrogen atom, and it also has a lattice-like structure akin to a crystal, which is sometimes why it's called liquid crystal. And so liquid crystal is able to store vast amounts of information. And it also behaves as a battery, which was a very interesting thing. When you go to the lab and you watch how they test for fourth phase water, it's really fun and it's kind of magic to see. Not all water outside of the body has fourth phase water in it, but some does. You'll find that the healing waters do. But most spring water, freshly collected, will have fourth phase water in it because it's been under pressure and it builds under pressure. So that's always nice to know. So it's why I recommend people, if you can go and collect spring water yourself, do it.
To get that.
So to see this fourth phase water is super interesting because you get a little test tube of water. You put something called microspheres in it, which allows you to see any movement in the water. And then you put this thing called a Naphion tube, which is like a little see-through tube. And then you look through a microscope. If there's fourth phase water in there, or exclusion zone, which is what Dr. Jerry Pollack talks about, exclusion zone because it excludes solids, it pushes the dissolved solids away from itself. So it creates a negative charge, and then it pushes what's pushed out creates a positive charge. And where there's a negative and a positive, there's a battery. So when you're looking through a microscope, when you look at the tube, you'll see these microspheres moving through the tube round and round and round. So the water is creating this self-propelling battery. And that's what's happening in our cells. And it's really interesting.
That's fascinating.
And healthy cells are negatively charged. The earth is negatively charged, which is why it's so good to walk barefoot on the earth, because the negative charge comes up through our feet. It's why walking along the beach is so good for you, because there's so many negative ions that are coming off the ocean. And that's why we often feel better when we are walking along the ocean, walking along the beach. I started to understand also that that fourth phase of water is in the in-between stages, right? And I always think the secrets are in the subtleties. Mm-hmm. So in the in-between stages of freezing, but before something is frozen, and as it's melting, but before it's liquid, it can be found in those two stages. So I began to wonder, well, when is the water starting to design, to create these pictures I'm seeing? Maybe it's in that stage he's talking about, this freezing stage. And so I started, just out of curiosity, opening my freezer earlier and earlier to see what was happening. And I had a freezer setting back then, which was my favorite freezer. I miss it. It was set at minus 20, I think it was minus 24, 25 degrees Celsius. And after about 4.5 minutes, around about 4.5 minutes, there was liquid on top and ice underneath. And I thought that was really interesting. So I took it out, held it upward so I could, have a better look at the crystallography that was glued to the glass dish I was using. And the liquid water fell away. And there was this absolutely remarkable, complex imagery. And I haven't frozen water solid now since then. So I look back at my original work where I saw the hand and the fish and all these other things I saw, and I'm really amazed that water was so keen to communicate, to be able to do it. Because when you realize how water freezes in 3 stages, you begin to understand something important that makes, I think, my technique that I use now and that I teach people, why it's so special. So I call it the first freeze. It's when it's the original first freeze that happens. And then there is a second freeze, which kind of hovers over the first freeze. and there's liquid water in between the two. So then it's like a ice sandwich with liquid water in the middle. That's what it kind of looks like, right? And the first freeze shares the most information that's relative to the inspiring influence. So if your thought was, I don't know, of a book, right? And you have a relationship and a bond with water where you're not expecting water to create the book, but it's interested enough in you to go, oh, she's thinking about a book. And here's what I see. Which we might want to have to dive into because that might seem rather rudimentary for some people. If you don't know the different levels and stages of freezing, it's quite likely you will overfreeze it and miss that.
Mm-hmm.
And so when that second freeze has happened, it also has some patterning on it. And it's quite fun to overfreeze sometimes to around 20 minutes and see like the ice sandwich, for example. But then the in between that liquid stays liquid for the longest. It also has all of the dissolved salts and minerals in it. So that first freeze is kind of like that exclusion zone. It's very, very light. In fact, it even has a light source that I've captured every now and then. It's very silvery as well. And so it's a very distinctive look. The secondary layer is a little more dense. That third layer that freezes in the middle carries all of the salts and minerals and whatnot, and heavy metals if it's tap water and various other things. And it clouds the entire dish of ice over. Once it's a solid, it creates all these this darkness and these bubbles. So it's very, very hard to see the imagery unless it's really come up and going, hey, look at me. By learning about that, I started to use this technique. I do it every single day. I'm prolific, which is why I have so many photos. And so it might be nice for me to show you what I've kind of just talked about and give some examples of my work. Because without the pictures, people really don't understand why I'm so enthusiastic.
So share, and then for everyone listening that's not watching this on video, I'll include the link to the blog that will have the playback so that you can watch it on video too.
So these are my inspirations. As you can see, here are some kind of extremes of You Fall and Thank You of Emoto's work. This is Laurent's work. You can see the happy faces.
The hearts and the faces, that little smiling.
So adorable. Can't help but smile.
They're the cutest smiley faces that I've ever seen, actually. There's such lightness and joy. The heart is so pure. What beauty.
It is. They're so adorable. This is Thomas Hieronymus. Okay, so this was the hand that I saw in the ice. And so you can see that it does really look like
wow. Yes.
No doubt about it.
It's very clearly a hand.
Yeah. This is the fish. You might see it's quite textured. This is seawater collected from the beach, right? So it looks different than the salted ice you might be familiar with if you're a fisherman, for example, where they've just put salt in the water. They're not using seawater for that. So people use salted ice because it takes a very long time to melt once it's frozen. So you can see the fish, the tail, the eye, the gill.
And an eye and the different shapes. It's like there's almost a school of fish moving about, it looks like.
Yeah. So this is a wonderful example of my technique and compared to my old method, which was just simply freezing water over. So you can see how much light comes through and how much texture there is. You might be wondering what you're looking at on the right. You might be guessing. It looks kind of like an arrowhead. You would be, and it really does. So my son Rama, my children, all my children have grown up. All three of them have grown up watching me do this. My two younger ones more so because my oldest he's 22 this year, which is hard to believe.
Oh, goodness.
And so my son Rama's part Indian, and he was named after Lord Rama. And so Lord Rama always has a bow and arrow. And Rama was trying to convince me to buy him a bow and arrow. And we were having a talk about that. And anyway, he decided that he would project the thought of an arrow into the water. And the funny thing was, I actually have never shared this part, but he said, if an arrow shows up in the water, Mum, can I have a bow and arrow? So I guess he got that. He won.
Did he get it? Because this is very clearly a bow and arrow.
Yeah, he did. But yeah, not like It's also like a little play one, like a little plastic one. But yeah.
Right. Right.
But he did this. He photographed it too. He literally did the whole technique himself, and I think it's really, really remarkable.
It's beautiful.
This is kind of what you should see in the freezer. Obviously, each pattern's going to look different depending on what the water is designing. But in between the ice is liquid water. So there should be liquid and ice visible. You're going to drain that liquid water away. But don't just drain it down the sink, because actually it's still very, very potent water. It's potential. Still has potential. And plants really love it. So I often try to plants. But you can also drain it into another petri dish, and it will give you a secondary layer of information, which is really nice as well. So I see my technique like a glue and glitter picture. When I was a little girl, we were given a piece of paper and a glue stick, and the teacher said, draw a picture with the glue stick, sprinkle the glitter on, then shake the rest of the glitter away. And there you have this kind of glitter picture. The glue represents your conscious expression. The first freeze is like the glitter that was stuck to the glue. The excess water is potential. That's the same with the glitter that you take away. And then you have the picture. So now I don't know if this is going to, it's working. Okay. Now I'm going to start it here. Now, a very, very clever man who learnt my technique, who's in the private Facebook group for people that have my technique and are using it, which is over 1,000 people now. And it kind of proves that obviously it's not just me that can do this. Lots of people can. And this is water that's had no influence, but he's managed to speed up and freeze from beginning to end, from nothing, from liquid water all the way to solid. And it's a wonderful way that I can describe these 3 stages that I've been talking about. Now, this is the stage right here where I would normally take my sample out. This is the first freeze. You can see there's a lot of clarity in the imagery and the designs here of the patterns. What you're going to see almost simultaneously, and it's because it's sped up that it looks like it's happening simultaneously, is there's going to be something that like it washes over all of these patterns. That's the second freeze. And up the top, there is some dark color with bubbles that starts to go from the top to the bottom. That's the water in between the 2 layers of ice that is freezing. And you can see what happens, and it's really interesting.
Let's watch this.
So as we see, there is this washing over, and then there's these dark bubbles that come down, and the dark bubbles are literally in between these 2 layers of ice. And eventually it kind of comes in this kind of oval-like shape down the bottom, and then there is like a cracking. We always know that someone's over-frozen their sample when there's a lot of bubbles that appear in it. So that's very helpful.
It's just beautiful to watch the expression. And I know, we've talked a lot about, I'll let you go through this, but I'm really excited to talk about the relationship, your relationship and how that evolved in the consciousness.
Yeah, the topic you're talking about is one of my favorites. I really wanted to see if water could recognize faces, because as I mentioned, Jerry Pollack gave me some suggestions. I was talking about, people might think, I can just kind of make out a hand, or I can. So let's look at image recognition, right? So he asked me to put a questionnaire together of 25 of my photos, and simply they say, what does this look like to you? And I gave this questionnaire to people to sort of circulate throughout social media, so people didn't know it was coming from me or what they were looking at. And 297 approximately people did the survey, and 85% of them could recognize the images for what the influence was. And there were 3 of those images where 100% of people could recognize the images. So this is a pretty good hit rate.
This is incredible.
Yeah. I put my petri dish of water on top of my friend's photo for 30 seconds. 30 seconds is just a protocol that I give to people when they're beginning. But it's actually, the more I've worked with water, the more I realize that water knows what I'm thinking before I'm even going to think it. It's quite interesting, because that ties in with that idea of this bonding of relationship. And And then here's a bunch of different photos I've used of different faces so that you can see that water is designed the faces and that these are not random and that it identifies features. I think this is
And it's fascinating how it draws certain features, how its interpretation. I mean, it is the artist.
It is the artist. And I think you bring up an important part in that water is designing as an artist might, as opposed to creating like perfect replicas. And there is an art to being an artist. I think that this is a very interesting because there is definitely an artistic interpretation. People see colors coming through my work quite often and they go, well, how did the colors get there? There'll be two reasons why they're there. The main one is that I love to play with the different colors of the background because the ice layer is so thin, it allows color to come through. The other one is that occasionally when I go into schools and teach this work to children, I go in and I teach a mix of science and art, just as like an extra person that can go in and do something fun with the kids. Occasionally I say, well, why don't we get some food coloring and natural food colors, and you can drop them in if you want to add some colors and add some different things, textures and stuff. And so sometimes they want to do that. And I've played with that every now and then, but very rarely. I don't really. I've done a very small amount of work doing that. And so I always say if I've done it, which is why you might see some color. But for all of the things here, it's all natural color that comes through.
But how fun to get to include kids, in a process that they can really adapt to and understand.
I think that they're the future, right? So for children to be able to really see themselves as bodies of water that is not only sensitive to thoughts and environment and all these kinds of things, but that have power. And not the kind of power to overpower people, but the type of power that lights up a room, that lights up a world. I often say to the children, if your skin was invisible and your organs were see-through, what would you look like and how would you recognize your parents? And they always come back to things like we'd look like streams and waterfalls and tributaries. And one boy said he'd look like a brain-shaped cloud with electrical rain shining down through it. And I'm like, wow.
That's brilliant.
I know. And then one girl, she said, well, I'd always recognize my mummy because of the way she feels. And this then leads very much into this idea of what is water and what is it really doing in the body outside of performing its function? What is its other functions? Is there different aspects to water, of which of course there are, and I'm going to talk about them. I'll just share some examples of my work. This is just so people can see that they're actually not random. Everyone has a story behind it. For example, this dog was sniffing the petri dish of water before it froze, and his nose showed up.
Nose.
I love that picture. It's so cute. This is my old cat Jiva, little Jiva Weaver, and you can see his little features. And Jiva would often be looking in my petri dishes and trying to scoop something out that we could never see. It was odd. He would just stare at the dishes sometimes. So after he'd been staring at the dish of water, this is the image of Jiva that appeared in the ice. This is from when I was at a cafe. There was a Schnauzer dog that was drinking from a bowl of water that they'd left out for thirsty dogs. And I was like, oh, God, I really want to see what it would look like. And so the woman must have thought I was absolutely bonkers, as I said to her, I know this is going to sound crazy, but hey, I'm a water crystallographer. I'm doing this and doing that. Showed her some photos, tried her to make, feel comfortable. Anyway, she gave me a take some of the dog bowl water away. And I just came home and froze it. And, you can really see the face here. But because of the format of this design, you can't see the body as well. It even include the body.
But how it really focused on the eye. It's just fascinating, the creation.
This one was from someone who was pregnant. I got her to drink some water, thinking of her baby, and then leave me some water, of which I froze. And you can see how much it looks like the embryo. And it's got this light from around the spine into the head. And I did a very interesting interview with a guy called Dr. Mauro Zapatero. He's a Harvard doctor, literally saying that the cerebrospinal fluid is the key to cosmic consciousness or the portal.
Wow. And that it's lit up around the embryo image. Wow. It's just fascinating, the interpretation of not just the art, but again, that information that, you're not thinking of, that that woman drinking the water wasn't thinking of, and that it knows that it has its own intelligence.
It does. And when you drink water, it mixes with your saliva. It gives water all the information about you. And you always have to remember that when I've done tests using saliva, what we see as it freezes is that often it will design an image relative to your last word. So that means that whatever word you speak before you eat, or especially before you drink, that's the first liquid of your body that anything comes into contact with. And so it's sharing its own information. Literally, your saliva is the welcoming committee. So when you're drinking water or eating food and you've blessed it, or you've said what you're grateful for or something like that, that's still resonating in your mouth. So I think that's a very important thing, even when we are intimate. What was the last word we spoke before we kissed? What information are we sharing? Are we conscious of that even at all? And it's kind of an interesting thing when you become more conscious of these things, how intimate and how deep you can actually really dive with your partner. So this one here, I'd asked water if it knew my name, and I've just put my way I link my initials naturally beside it so you can see what it did. It's like amazing.
Wow.
Batman's there because my son did that, right? So he often watches
the Batman.
yeah, he often watches the movie with a petri dish of water beside him on the couch, and then freezes it. So
I love that relationship. He's like, we're just hanging out, we're friends.
I wish he did that more. He's 15 now, so he's kind of growing up into other realms, but it's okay. And you can see here, this was an interesting one because the water designed this clear ring, and it was sitting beside a wedding invitation that I was given. And here I put my thumb into the water and taken it out and frozen it. You can see my thumb is in the ice, but you'll notice that there's a little chip in the nail. 3 hours after I'd done that thing, I actually chipped my nail in exactly the same place. So that's not the first time that's happened where water is showing me something that is going to happen. I don't need to see that water can be a photocopier, or that water can see it, can not a photocopier, that's not the right word, because that's not what it is. But I don't feel the need anymore to show water something and then maybe see if it can design it. I'm more interested now in what water can teach me. So I use virtually no inspiring influences anymore other than an open invitation that water teach me and that I learn and that I'm open enough to learn. So I was doing that a few years ago, and I saw this obelisk shape in the ice. And I was looking around. I was like, often water will show me something nearby, but
Right.
I couldn't see anything. And I'm like, well, I guess I don't know what that means. And that's okay. And then a few hours later, a friend of mine came back, and she'd been to this crystal shop that we both like to go to. And she got this crystal out, and the crystal was in the shape of an obelisk, and it was really special. It's very nice. And she said, have you ever seen anything quite like it? And I showed her my ice picture, and I'm like, oh yeah, actually, look at that. She was really blown away.
I mean, it's incredible because, what comes to mind when you speak of this is really it's water is using my background is in quantum energetics. And so it's understanding this time space. It operates in the same time space as what we understand of quantum physics and the capacity to move forward and backwards in time with, possibilities in that. I mean, it's incredible that water can tap into that information.
And I think we're just learning, because I think water has so much to do with virtually every aspect of life.
Mm-hmm.
Because there is no life without water. It has to have everything to do with it. including death. And I want to talk about that because I'll kind of maybe skip through some stuff so we can get into that deeper conversation. I know
Okay.
you want around conscious expression.
This is just so beautiful.
Thank you. And these are all from people that are not me. So I think it's always fun to see that other people can do this work. Each one has a story. The only one I'll mention is that it might be really random that someone would ever do anything about nail clippers, but it wasn't intentional. It was sitting beside the Petri dish. And this was from John. John works with me and he's amazing. He's as prolific as I am using my technique, except he lives in the States, in Utah, where it gets freezing. So he actually does all his freezing outside. So we can now say that we know that the pictures that we've seen of his are the same as a lot of the pictures we've seen when we've been looking for hydroglyphs and when we've been looking at certain other images and like signature patterns, because water communicates in 3 ways. And we need to talk about that, is that we know that it's not the freezer creating them or something blowing in over the water. We know that these happen organically and we've seen them. He films it too. So, I'm going to do a live with him at some point because he's really inspiring. And he likes to invite water to share whatever it wants. Now, this is where it gets very interesting because we need to talk about the significance of light. Water naturally absorbs photons. So water has a light source within it. Now, I spoke at the annual water conference in Germany, and I was the final speaker at the banquet in October of last year. And I'm speaking to a bunch of scientists and physicists and biologists. I was a bit nervous to share what I'm about to share with you because I'm like, I don't know how they're going to receive it. But every single one of them had well, maybe not every single one, but most of them had a aha moment, right? And so I had been speaking to a woman who said that she could communicate with bees. And she said that she would watch their hives for long periods of time. And one day a bee came out and communicated to her and said, "We don't mind you looking at our hive, but can you please not look at it for so long because your conscious expression is putting too much light in the hive and we like it to be darker."
Wow.
And I thought, oh, so where we put our conscious expression is also where we put our light. And then that made me remember some really unusual and very cool photos that I've taken of water just as it's beginning to freeze in the freezer. If I can just get it at exactly the right time, like in this picture, you can see that there is a light, like a halo around each ice spearhead, if you will. That's they look like spears, right? So they all have halos. And I actually think what is happening is that the water, as it's beginning to turn to ice, pushes out its light source. And so I think it's light that paves the way for the design of the imagery.
Wow.
So
That actually makes so much sense.
it does. And then you kind of think about this 4th phase of water, which is the first freeze, really. And then you think 4th phase water is able to absorb more light. So once it's absorbed it, surely it's able to then release it. And what's it doing with that light in this freezing? I think that it's designing, and that's remarkable.
It's communicating in
These
light.
And these are the 3 ways that I've seen that water communicates. When you begin to learn how to do the technique, I always suggest you invite water to share whatever it wants. It's not about you. It's about learning about water. Because your connection with water, your relationship with water does make a difference. If you go into this, and this is why water is also my spiritual teacher. Because if you think, well, water's going to just design all this amazing stuff for me because I love it, right? And like Laurent says, water opens its heart to those that love it. And then it doesn't do what you think it's going to do. This is a wonderful, wonderful test that water will teach us sometimes, but not always. And it's taught me that many times. The moment that I think I know what it's going to do, I am reminded that water is wild and that I am not approaching it in the right way. Now, if you have ever been one of those people that might go out into the forest And you've had that experience where a wild animal gets close to you or is curious about you or even comes and eats out of your hand. And it makes you feel so excited because you know how wild it is and that it is usually afraid of people. And what an honor it is that they've come to you or seen you or looked at you or haven't run away. There's something really magical in that time where your relationship with that animal is the kind of relationship we should try to strive for with this relationship with water, where we just are so honored that it is even looking at us and not running away, that we are able to start to maintain and create an environment and an energy of trust. Now, this is where it gets interesting because that is where I've seen water can design in these three ways. Quite commonly, in the beginning stages, water will share its signature pattern. So different types of water have their own signature pattern that I've identified. There's 4 examples here. Municipal tap water tends to be very disordered. Filtered water looks like a filter with lines kind of clumped together. Spring water forms these lovely stars with like ferns off each leg that form a kind of shape of a hexagon, which is actually also a hydroglyph for the meaning of living and another meaning of gratitude and another meaning of death. Now, we want to talk about hydroglyphs in a minute because they really are huge. Rainwater looks like a fanning pattern. Now, if you don't know the signature pattern of your water because you've launched straight into wanting to do something else with it, you're not going to know if it's changed. You're not going to know anything about the water at all. Inviting water to share something about itself, often it will show you a signature pattern. Not always. Sometimes it'll go straight into something else, but it's nice to know that they're there. And I've repeated enough of them to know that that's a very traditional pattern that you would see for the different waters. Then there is art. I always say art is the heart of water. It loves to design and imagery. Then we have hydroglyphs. Now, hydroglyphs are a whole nother thing, and it's where I'm getting a lot more interest of the scientific community from. I have some examples here. So what is a hydroglyph? A hydroglyph is a symbol in ice that I have seen occur after I've used a word influence. So water doesn't read words, it absorbs the energy of words and crystallizes into the form and into a formative shape that is to the energy of a word. So if I take my glasses and I hold them up here and I show you my glasses, like nobody is falling off their chair in excitement about this. Okay, it's not. This is just my reading glasses. Okay, great. We've labeled these glasses. But if I say this is the energy of my glasses, I could write an entire essay on that because the energy of my glasses means that it gives me some vision. It forms to the shape of my face. It has my energy in it because glass is essentially made of silica. Silica is a crystal. Crystals store information and they help water to. So that's why I use glass dishes because it helps water to store information for longer. There is so much to say about energy. When you talk about what is the energy of something, you don't just look at it in one way, the same way that we do when we label something. So water crystallizes into the energy of a word. So we've used the same word in different languages and seen the same symbol. So this is something I have a team working on.
That's incredible.
These are just a few little examples. This is the coin glyph, which is the symbol for the energy of the word money, and which is also the secondary layer of meaning is the energy of the word abundance. Now, abundance doesn't necessarily have anything to do with money, but the money, see, someone once said to me, well, why would water in all its wisdom and ancientness even want to talk about money? Like, why would it even have anything to do with it? Money is the root of all evil is what she said. And I'm like, oh, this is a good that I get to see how people might respond to that. So what I said is that, well, look at the shape. The shape is a coin. It's very, very three-dimensional, as if someone literally stuck a coin in the ice. And they're extremely identifiable. So we have been flicking coins into wishing wells since goodness only knows how long. Our relationship with money and coins has actually been around a really long time. In ancient Greek and Roman times, when someone would die, they would put 2 coins on their eyes so that they could pay the ferryman to take them across the river to Hades. And once they got to Hades, there were several rivers. 2 of them were very significant where they would get to drink from. They would get to drink from either the river of remembering or the river of forgetfulness. And if they drank from the river of remembering, they would then remember everything. And they would often be sent back to the living world as kind of saints, if you will, and people that had great vision of life. And then people would often drink from the river of forgetfulness and go over to Hades, and they would forget many, many things about their old life. And then they would be given another life. And that kind of ties into this concept of reincarnation and not remembering your old life, all of which is just super interesting in old history. Then we kind of look at this and then we go, okay, well, if this is the energy of money, this then suggests, do you know your own worth? What is your relationship with the energy of money? Do you even have one? And perhaps one of the things that has helped me is like when I started thinking, what is the energy of money and do I actually have a relationship with it? Why do we have money? To exchange as an exchange for something. And money in the past, it's been shells, it's been rocks, it's been beads, it's been a lot of things. And we use it as an exchange. So are we able to not only receive, but are we able to give? Are we able to give and receive? What is the balance here? So I kind of tend to think that also, if this is a language, right, then why would we can't pick and choose the words we think are good or bad. And even thinking something is good and bad doesn't really exactly resonate here, in that water is not in judgment. And that's one of the most important, significant things that I've discovered about water, is that there are two clear aspects to it. This is one area which we need to discuss because it definitely talks about what we're seeing in this work. It's called water's energetic state of health. So tap water, people are very shocked when I say this, is one of the most responsive waters when I use my technique. People think, well, how can it be? Oh my God, it's full of heavy metals and it's got XYZ in it. And it's like dead water, which poor old tap water gets such a bad rap. I'm not talking about drinking it, but I'm talking about what it's teaching us. When you get to know the signature patterns of tap water, municipal tap water, then so this is a good example in this image here.
This is just incredible that from one to the other, just
so
the love. Wow.
Yes, and there's even more. So this frozen tap water, I let it melt and then I held it in a liquid stage to my heart for a minute in a loving way. And then I refroze it, where this is the same exact water. So then you get to see, oh, there's a huge fern in it now. It's not just disordered, and you're getting to see fronds and we're getting to see large leaves. We're seeing a huge structural change, but we're not seeing a chemical change. So what does that mean? Like, that's important. We're not seeing a chemical change and we're only seeing a structural change. Then what are we seeing? You can see the same thing has happened here. Up the top is a lot of different samples of tap water. And then I would let that melt, refreeze it after giving it love and gratitude. So you can see it started to form with these beautiful shapes.
Mm-hmm.
And then also same here, when you get the tap water and you put it in a singing bowl and play it, you can see it starting to form these beautiful sort of spiraled formations. Here we have more tap water, and this is after it's been filtered through silk. And this is really interesting because the first time I ever saw anyone doing that was when I was in India, and India is kind of a second home to me in many ways. I've been there 9 times. I go out in the villages, so I've never gone as a tourist before, really. I've gone to stay at the ashram and I've gone to stay with people. So I went out into the villages and there were 3 women. 2 were holding a sari, a silk sari out, and one was pumping water so that the water went through the sari and was collecting into a bucket. And when I asked them what they were doing, the interpreter said that the silk filters the water, but it also helps the water to filter the heart. And I thought that was really interesting because even Rudolf Steiner talks about to his students about filtering water through silk. And Jerry Pollock, when I talked about this, said that's exclusion zone, that 4th phase water begins to build when it's next to silk. So often I'll say to people, if you're a handy person, make a silk bag to hold your water bottle in.
Yeah, that's such an interesting idea that, utilizing because of the entire process of the way silk is come into formation, the
Well,
organic processing.
I found a company actually, because I'm working on making a silk filter with my husband, and we found a company that where the silkworm doesn't die, where they're able to get the silk without killing the worm.
Wow.
And I think that's really nice because the
Yeah.
little worm is basically making a cocoon, and that cocoon is the silk. And that means it's created a home for transformation, which is one of the reasons I think we see such big changes. But I was talking to a lady because I have a masterclass coming up in early June, which is called What Different Religions, Cultures, and Ancient Texts and Faiths Can Teach Us About Water. And this Christian woman was talking about the energetic properties of wool, linen, and cotton and silk, particularly of wool and linen in these situations, then their frequencies. And so someone has done a study, I can't remember where she was from, in the more recent times, on different materials and natural fibers like linen, cotton, wool, and silk. They are all charged by the sun, but they also have a high frequency, whereas synthetics have the same frequency as someone who is dead, a dead body. And linen and wool, they have some of the highest frequencies, something like 5,000. And like dead is somewhere around 10.
Isn't
And
that
so
incredible when we think
it,
about how much synthetic materials we have in our homes and why we're all getting sick?
yeah, and and cotton is the same as a living person. So, think about what our sheets are made of, for example. Things like this. This information has been around a long time. Anyway, so I've filtered water also through linen and through wool and through cotton. And I've seen that it does make a structural improvement when you use tap water as your control. I hate that word, but people understand what I mean when I say it.
Right.
Now you can use my technique on urine too. I've done loads of different things with different bodily fluids, and also other things that are watery, like wine and beer and gin, like kombucha and fruit juices and coffee and all kinds of stuff. It's
Yeah.
like so fun because you can use it once you know it. You can use it for lots of things.
What did you see with coffee? I'm really curious about this because, a lot of people are saying, oh, coffee is as hydrating as water. And I'm like, I don't know how I feel about that statement, but I'm fascinated to hear what you saw.
Well, I've never actually heard anyone say that. So maybe
I just heard a study. Someone came out and said now science is showing coffee is almost as hydrating as water. And I'm like, I mean, I don't know.
Well, what I see is structures. So I've seen that instant coffee creates terribly awful looking structures, and organic coffee tends to form very ordered structures. So you get to start to see patterning and ferning. I did one with that guy who has bulletproof coffee, the bulletproof coffee.
Oh, right.
I can't remember his name.
Dave Espray.
Yes, yeah. And his one was really interesting. I sent it to Jerry Pollack actually, and Jerry apparently sent it on to him, but I never heard anything back. But his one was like woven hay. It looked like straw, as if it had been literally woven like tapestry. It was it was different than all the others. It was quite interesting, but but I've seen gorgeous patterns and really fresh organic coffee. So it's fun because you can do that. You just brew it and then you do my technique and you can see there's such big differences. This was with urine. Urine's so easily accessible for anyone. We just open a dish. And so you can see the difference and urine also has gone through us. So it's literally teaching us something about ourselves. So you can see the difference between a dehydrated person and a hydrated person, a stressed person and the same person after doing an hour of meditation. If I'm frustrated or angry, what happens? Well, water doesn't judge me, but it doesn't also play with me. It thickens in the dish and darkens, which should only really happen when it's solid, right? So this very bizarre, it behaves in a very unusual way in that it just will not design complex patterns at all. But if I'm sad, well, like spring water doesn't degrade or go awful, but it starts to reflect me. And in these two, it wasn't that I was using my emotion as my influence at all. I just was sad and I was doing crystallography, and rather than do anything else, it just reflected my sad face.
It's a very sad little face that's showing.
It really is.
It's very sad.
You see here, it's opened up quite often. When water really wants to communicate in various ways, there can be a few reasons why water might do this. One is a practical way, whereas sometimes all Petri dishes, if you run your finger along the bottom of them, you realize that some have as flat, but not many. Surprising amount are not flat. Some have dips and some have bumps. If they have a bump, you'll often find the water will try and open up in the middle when it's liquid and when it's in the freezer. And so sometimes you'll see that. But sometimes, even though I use the same amount of water will open up in certain places just organically. And this was one of the case in that particular one.
Interesting.
Now, this is where we get to spirit. The Maori word, my dad is Maori, it's the Indigenous people of New Zealand. They have a word for spirit, which was wairua. Y, W-A-I, it means water. Rua means two. Two waters. The spiritual waters and the physical waters. Now, this is an extremely rudimentary explanation of that. And it's a very big and deep word, but I think of it as the active participant and the observer. So I've interviewed lots of people who have had near-death experiences, and I'm always open. If anybody's had one, please reach out to me because I'm always interested.
I've had 3 actually.
Oh, well, I definitely want to talk to you.
Yes. One quite, and then also I've been a generational seer and shaman for my whole life. So since I was a child, so that made the near-death experience quite interesting.
Veda did. Well, I'd love to talk to you further about that.
Happy to.
But with the people that I've interviewed, there were 3 that said the same thing. They said they have this sense of rising, which if you imagine a gas, that's what gases do, they rise. And I think that the observer aspect of water is more akin to the ether or the air aspect, gas aspect, or the vapor aspect, somewhere in that realm. And the physical waters, liquid waters, are much more in the physical realm of the hydrating or the function of the body. So when they said that they felt themselves rising, the next thing they said was that they looked down upon their body and watched their body being resuscitated with absolutely no attachment or even recognition that that was them. And so that ties very much into this idea that the spiritual aspect of water is the observer and never in judgment. And I say that because we can use that ourselves as a tool. So whenever I'm triggered, which gratefully doesn't happen as much, but I know that everyone can get triggered by something. We've all got life that's happened. But one of the things we can do is use our ability to observe ourselves whilst we're having a reaction and ask the question, when was the first time you felt like this? To really understand, am I responding to this person because this is very real and relevant, or am I responding this way to this person because I'm reacting, it's triggering me from something that happened a long time ago that actually has nothing to do with them? And I think this is always an important question to ask. And I use that myself. Some people who have had psychedelic experiences may have had an experience of observing themselves as well. I know my son has, which sounds really weird to say that my son's had a psychedelic experience, but he broke his arm. He's 15 and he broke his arm skateboarding this year. And so we had to take him to hospital. And the doctor said, right, we're going to give him ketamine and he's going to be here, but he's not going to be here, whilst the nurses reset his arm. Within 4 seconds, I cannot believe how fast it worked. I was actually shocked how fast it happened. They put it in intravenously in his arm. Within 4 seconds, Rama said, "What the He didn't finish the word. His eyes were like bulging, his mouth was open, and all I saw him do for the whole time that his arm was getting fixed was that he was like looking around. And when he came around, which actually took a long time, I asked him about it, and he said, "Mum, I was in the corner watching them work on my arm." He was able to even tell me what I was talking about. I was having a joke with one of the nurses, and then he said he went into these wormholes and vortexes and had this crazy, amazing experience, but he observed himself. We can observe ourselves in dreams. People that astral travel can say that they can, observe things outside of the body. So how can we be alive and observe ourselves outside of a body? So I often think there's two worlds, the one we live upon or on, and the one we live in. And the world we live in, we experience through our senses. So we see, and that's information that's processed by the brain. We hear, and the hearing comes in through the ears, taste comes in through the tongue, touch comes in through the fingers. And so we have all these experiences and thoughts. We think thoughts inside of our body. So what do we actually ever experience that's outside of this physical body? There are a couple of things, but one of them is that we can observe ourselves. Like, I literally am able to, because I guess I've been doing it for so long, I can observe myself kind of from the back of my head. If I actually just kind of go into a slightly different space, it's not that hard. Even my son Rama, he was like, I said, "Can you observe yourself, other than that one psychedelic experience?" And like, "Well, yeah." He said, "I do it all the time." I'm like, "Really?" And he says, "Yeah, when I'm at school and I'm bored." And I'm like, "What?" And he says, "Yeah, I just kind of like, just kind of go and look above everybody's heads and just kind of look around the room because I'm just in that in-between state." And I'm like, "Oh, that's really interesting."
I love how he plays in between the worlds.
He does.
Mhm.
And I'll say that, I talked a great deal about my car accident. And I think this picture is here. So this was the car accident that I was in. And below is Ram.
Wow.
And you can see it's a miracle I got out of that.
That's
And
incredible.
yeah, my son Rama down there, and he's older now. This was a couple of
Such
years ago.
a cutie pie.
He's a cutie pie. And but when he was nearly 3, I was talking to a friend that had come down from Auckland. This was when I used to live in Christchurch. The day before the big Christchurch earthquake, the second one, I was there for both. I was telling her about it, and Rama, as children often do when they're that age, they spy on their parents. And so he was like spying on me. And then when I finished talking, I remember he like showed himself. He just appeared out of nowhere, and he said, "I remember that, Mummy." He said, "I remember coming down out of the clouds." And he said, "I went like this," and he put his arm around me, "and I saved you. And when I knew you were okay, I climbed back up the ladder into the clouds."
Wow.
And he was so matter of fact. And the thing is that he said something that he shouldn't have known about, that I hadn't even talked about, that I don't usually ever talk about. He said, "I remember the window wipers and the tires." And it started to rain, and the window wipers were still going somehow when all of this happened. And there was some significance, like, so when we had impact, that the window wipers were going. And so there was something of that he had brought into that conversation, which was something that he shouldn't have known about. The tires, like literally here, kind of just went, the other ones just went off. They
They're
were
just all over the place. The tires. I mean, this photo, the image is just incredible. It's truly a miracle that you're alive.
really is. So there's this idea. So if we are alive, how can we also observe ourselves outside of the physical? So if that observer is the consciousness, if the observer is the spirit, how can people, when they have a near-death experience, leave their body and come back into it? Doesn't the body need a soul to run, so to speak? And so it's a good question, and it's something to look at. And I've been very interested my whole life in what people believe in different religions and cultures and this kind of thing, which is why I'm so much looking forward to my masterclass because it's really a whole masterclass based on what I really want to learn about. What is the silver thread? You hear about the silver thread being the tether of the soul to the body. And so what if that silver thread is electrical charge? So this makes sense to me because how do we have energy? Like, how do we feel energy? We talk about our intuition. We know we have energy. We know we're sensitive to energy, some more so than others. But how does that work? Like, there's a lot of practical things that aren't talked about, but accepted. When we breathe out, we're breathing out a vapor. There's water, that we're creating water in the air. We can't see it, but the fact that we breathe out means that there is water in the air. So right now, and of course that varies with different densities, but I'm talking about it in a very subtle way, more in a quantum way than in the real kind of, although this is physical, like this is a real thing, but I'm interested in the subtleties is what I'm trying to say. So this water in the air is extremely attracted to electrical charge. We have electrical charge, which can be measured by heart math. And that's certainly not a thing. And that can vary depending on our energies and our output, if you will. And so we're literally walking around with a web of liquid crystal information. So it's like a liquid antenna that we have. And so we can walk into a room of a house and it not only might it feel cold, but it might give us the creeps and we're like, oh, I don't know, something really gross here. I don't like it, doesn't feel good. But how do we feel that? Like, how do we know it doesn't feel good? So we have this ability to absorb information from our environment and feel it. Imagine like a spider web that's got lots of dew on it, and that dew can send information on the wires of the thread, so to speak, of the web into us. And we also can share our own information out. So when we meet somebody and we have this immediate liking for them, or that love at first sight feeling even, or this, oh, I feel like I've always known you kind of feeling, or often that comes from our energetic patterns that are created that create this kind of three-dimensional web around us and look very similar or match another person's. And so rather than it being twin flames, it's kind of like twin patterns. And you'll often notice when two people are very close, or they're really falling in love, or they're just getting to know each other, and they really have a deep liking for one another, they'll often copy each other's behavior in the way that they move. So if somebody's talking and their head is tilted, the other person tends to tilt their head. If somebody's holding their hand up like this, you'll often notice that the other person is doing that. It's one of the indicators, if somebody likes you. They tend to copy your behavior. This is also happening energetically through this kind of water web, if you will, is that the patterns tend to copy each other the more you like somebody. And this is very interesting in the area of intimacy, because that's where you're really working with the most complex waters in the body, in the spine, and that's spinal fluid. It kind of also all the way up the spine and bathes the brain. And my friend, Dr. Mauro Zapatero, he's a Harvard doctor, and he said that the spinal fluid is literally the portal to cosmic consciousness. It's really interesting because when I did a call with him, he talks about how there's an ancient Buddhist practice where it's really important to learn how to die well. I'll come back to these pictures in a second. And he said that because they want to attain the Buddha, one of the ways in which you can tell that they have attained that through the death process is that there will be like one little clear drop of fluid where their fontanelle is. Obviously, that closes up when we are born and slowly closes up, but it's basically around about here. And that, he says, he believes is a drop of the cerebrospinal fluid. I think that's extremely interesting when you start looking through the different cultures and their different understandings of fluids. So you'll notice here, there's a few pictures, so I'll explain them. This is me and my mum. When I lived in Japan, which was some years ago now, Mum and I would write letters to each other. This was before cell phones and computers, which makes me feel literally prehistoric. It was really nice because I'd look forward to receiving, a handwritten letter. We just don't really do them much anymore. So at the end of every letter, though, Mum would make some attempt at drawing a circle and she'd put a little heart in the middle. And Mum's circle's like really bad. And she'd be the first to admit it. She always struggled with circles, but I was missing her because she died in 1999. She had breast cancer and that led to bone cancer. And anyway, she was my best friend. Mum was just a walking angel, really. I think, we are a body full of memories. And one of the best things that we leave behind when it's our time to go is the memories we leave in the hearts of others. And so her memories are always with me. So I asked the water, can you connect to my mum? And the first time I saw this was this one. And I was like so shocked because no one else knew about those letters. I have a stack of them.
It's a wonky circle with a heart, a very clear heart in the middle.
And Mum always used to say to me, I'll always be with you. Even if I'm not in this body anymore, I'm always with you. Then on her birthday the next year, I asked the same question and I got the same image, and which is the one beside it. And it meant so much to me because, Mum was very rarely ever wrong. And Mum was not the kind of person to say things she didn't mean. I've begun to really see that through the study of water, many of my biggest questions have started to be answered. I think that water is able to travel through all realms. It is in the state of ether or air or vapor, whether it's, any of its stages. We literally know so little about water that science can't agree upon where it even came from and how it seeded the earth, whether it was already here in the earth's mantle, which is called primary water, or whether it was seeded from asteroids and meteorites that hit the earth. Either one is alien to us, and yet it's a substance of which we cannot live without. And we get taught all the time about how much carbon we are, but in fact, we're so much water, and yet we don't really study water very much at all. We're certainly not in schools, other than, some obvious things. I think the real study of water is the study of life, and life includes the inevitable death.
Right.
And when you look at the things we're made of, which, pardon the pun, you boil it down as it's water, salts, minerals, and consciousness. And when you look at salt, and I have done a whole study on salt, when you look at salt and you put salt into water, it disappears. But if you say, for example, you get some seawater and you let the water evaporate, the salts will still be there. In fact, they would have taken back their cubic structures. When someone is cremated, the ashes are actually salts. Salt, much like water, is a shapeshifter, and it doesn't appear to die, if you will. We label dead water. Tap water people might say dead water, or polluted water. They say that's dead water, but it's actually, not a truth. Water will always evaporate. Water will always be in one of its stages. And I think this is important. Now, these are they all have other stories to them. Maybe I can share them. So, really quick.
Yeah, your mom, she's very much with you. I can see her now. I can see, and she's entirely with you. And as you speak about her, it's kind of, hey, that kind of thing.
I feel her. I think whenever you think of someone, they're there. They're always there.
Which goes back to this web, which I find really interesting. I've watched plasmic energy, and I hear it's almost like the wind whispers information. There's language and intelligence all around us. You're talking about this web of water, and I've heard you say about the magnetism of water, the way it carries and magnetizes us to certain places and to each other. And I find this so fascinating because I've felt it at different times in my life in so many different ways, in body, out of body, in different realms. And even in my near death, the water around me, the material, I felt a plasma around me protect me. It was in a car accident. And there was plasma around me that was so dense. It felt like I was being encapsulated from a very, very thick bubble. It's fascinating now. I've always kind of just thought, okay, well, that just appeared and vanished. But the more that I'm hearing your work, it's so fantastic because it really is the water that carries the information through our entire universe, let alone our planet.
Oh, it always makes me happy when people are able to start to piece things together, because water is an ultimate truth. We're so much in search of that, especially now more than ever. And I think truth is an interesting one because it provides so many more things than we might imagine. And in this particular one, it's kind of like there is this very provocative question as to what if water is God? And I think I cover this in this. I think there's a little bit about that. And I'm not suggesting that that is a truth at all. I'm suggesting that it's an interesting thing to look into,
But
because
it makes sense though. I mean, if consciousness is God and God is consciousness and we are all a part of the same material, then it would make sense.
well, it's interesting because when you look at consciousness and then you look at water and you look at them separately, we could say they're totally different things. But when you actually put them together, they kind of behave as one. And whether water is consciousness, or as my friend Moses Hackman might say, water is the glove on the hand of consciousness, I'm not sure. But I do know that they are so intimately entwined that they do behave as one. And I think it's very interesting, which is one of the other reasons I'm so excited to do this masterclass, because this is the topic. Is there anywhere in different religions that suggests that water and God are synonymous? And there is. And that's what some people are bringing forward in there. It's so interesting. And it's always up to us to make our own decisions and thoughts about things. And I'm not telling people what to think at all. But my area of inquiry has led me on to become much more curious about looking into that concept. Because we don't, with looking at water, death is a transition of life. And that's shown in the hydroglyph for living and death. So we're going to get into hydroglyphs in a second. This was when I asked water to connect to my friend's dad. So what had happened is that the water in the Petri dish, I'd left it overnight. It's a long story, which I do talk about in some other podcasts, because it would take quite a bit more time to explain the whole story. But essentially, I left it overnight for a reason. And when I came back the next morning, a lot of the water had evaporated without any particular reason why it should have done. So I just froze what was left, and all of it froze into this heart shape. I actually got it on video, which was really cool. This was when I was thinking about my ancestors on my mother's side, who had only ever heard Mum briefly talk about, but never knew, going back some generation. I know that on her side, there's a couple of women who were burnt at the stake for being witches because they were midwives. It's so crazy what used to constitute being a witch. Did you know that if a woman were to let her milk curdle, she was considered a witch?
Really?
It's like, what the heck? If she was rich, she was considered a witch, and if she had wrinkles, it's like how you're not meant to allowed to go along. If you were outspoken as a woman, if you were single, if you didn't have children, these kinds of things, there's a suspicion there that you could be a witch.
Basically, if you are a woman, you are considered a witch.
That's insane that this was real, that people lost their lives because of this. This is very sad. Then over here, this was done, I did for a woman whose cat had died, and she was really sad, and her cat was like her baby, and she was really, really wanting to know if her cat could see her. And so I asked, can so-and-so's cat see her? And so you can see it very much looks like the cat's ears.
The cat's ears.
What's coming up next is something that was written, that was going around Instagram as a reel. And I wrote it out because I think it's very, very well said. So if water was God, is the question that was on the screen. So he said, well, that would mean that God is in us and all around us, above us and below us. It would explain why a woman's waters break when we're born and why some religions observe the ritual of baptism. If water was God, then that would mean that God has no gender. God takes the shape of the container God appears in, which would explain why we have so many different belief systems. It would mean that all bodies of water were holy, that a thunderstorm is a church without walls, that when the rain falls, it's an act of God's death giving life, and when it evaporates again, it's the day of resurrection. I think that's really interesting.
This is very interesting. I feel that's what I personally have seen and believe and understand as well.
So healing by proximity. So these 6 patterns here are the 6 patterns in egg albumin that is the egg white, but not just the gloopy gelatinous part. There is another part to the egg white which runs out a lot like saliva. It's quite thin, and it's different than the gloopy gelatinous part. It's easy to see if you just crack an egg open and you take out the yolk. You'll see that there are two parts to the egg white that are very identifiable. And I freeze the thin part that runs out like saliva, and I let it go into the dish and I freeze it. This is not about using your conscious expression. These are how the patterns of free-range eggs form. And what's interesting about it is that it happens in all bird eggs that I've used so far. Duck, chicken, quail, and goose eggs. So all of the patterns are the same in the bird species. I'm curious to see if I was able to get eggs from snakes or reptiles, for example, as to whether I might see different patterns, and then that might mean that there is information for the form of the bird. I've always thought that amniotic fluid holds ancestral information. Here we see the differences between a free-range hen egg and a caged hen egg. And the caged hen eggs can only form two of the patterns that I've shown here. They can form the small star and the pollen. They're the two most rudimentary of the six. So I had this idea that, inspired by Luc Montagneux's work, who I got to meet in 2019 before he passed away. He won the Global Peace Prize for his discovery of AIDS, but was very criticized for his discovery of what we might call DNA teleportation. And you think my work is kind of like, wow, like, well, that sounds crazy, amazing. Well, his work is like another level above that, in that he would get 2 vials of pure water. One he put a strand of DNA into. He would sit them side by side for several hours in ambient light with a low hertz frequency. Then he would move aside the one that had the sequence that he had identified. Then he would put some kind of powder which would be a precursor to DNA to see whether there was any DNA within the water at all. And they found that there was the sequence of DNA evident in the thing of water that was pure water and had no DNA in it in the beginning. So this is like why it's called DNA teleportation. And this is a very serious scientist. And this had been, he'd repeated that, and some other people had repeated it. You know, Jerry Pollack speaks very highly of Luc and his work and gave a whole big tribute to him at the last water conference in October. His work is very profound. So what does that say about just being near people, or let alone being intimate? What are we sharing in relation to being this concept of this DNA exchange? I mean, it's hard for us to kind of imagine, really. It's a deep dive to take. So I was like, well, why don't I put a free-range hen egg, of which I've done hundreds of tests for. I know exactly what they look like, and I know exactly what caged hen eggs look like. So I put one side beside the other. I left them overnight, and then I did the crystallography, and what I discovered was that the free-range egg looked the same, beautiful patterns as you would see here, but the caged hen egg patterns had actually started to improve. That was a surprise because I haven't seen it ever do that. And so I shared it on social media, and not necessarily funny, but the thing that happened was that huge amount of people said, yeah, but what if you surround it by bad eggs? Surely it's going to go bad. And so I did that twice. What would happen? So here are my two controls, the free-range egg. Here is the caged hen egg. All of the eggs I used were from the same batch. And so in the middle, I put the free-range hen egg, and I put the eggs around in this order, and I left them overnight. Now, here is the first result for test 1. Here are the regular patterns I would see in my usual free-range happy hen egg, surrounded by completely transformed caged hen eggs that now like free-range eggs. Further away, there is some improvement, but it isn't anywhere as close to the ones that surround the free-range egg. Now here I do it again. Here are my two controls, and here's the results. So again, we see regular patterns of...
You say the same impact, because I would think that too, but the higher consciousness, the higher frequency matter is actually the impact of everything around versus the opposite way around.
I think we also need to look at, well, firstly, when people say, yeah, it'll go bad because it's surrounded by bad, we're not really looking any much deeper than that, because it's not that the caged hen eggs are evil. We're looking at this primordial and primal, very formative stage of eggs, right? It doesn't make sense that the bad eggs, so to speak, want to get worse and want to get revenge on the good egg, which is kind of what people are almost saying, right? It doesn't make any sense, because when you look at nature, the weak don't do well. It doesn't make sense that they would want to get any worse. What makes sense is that they would want to improve, especially before anything hatches. And so what's more interesting to me is how the free range hen egg stays so beautiful and it is not being depleted by giving off its information. This is interesting because I think that nature is looking to improve rather than downgrade, especially in this embryonic stage. I also think that information transfer is possible because water is a type of liquid antenna, and egg albumin is approximately 90% water. And given that none of these eggs were fertilized, because this is that whole what came first, the chicken or the egg thing, it's fascinating that information was still transferred to the caged eggs, perhaps meaning that the potential for life was there from the very beginning. My personal takeaway from this, by molecular count, again, we're 99% water, is simply if we heal ourselves, we heal others. And the pictures beside the words there is where each one is in half. I really enjoyed biomimicry. I think we can learn a lot about what things look like in the ice, about what their meanings might be. So here I've split this in half. This is the feathery patterns that I see in the ice, and this is feathers. This is in half. This is a feather. This is the ice. You can't even tell that this is
You can't tell the difference in many of them.
And this is in half. This is coral, and this is ice, and so on and so forth. I might just flick through this, but maybe people can stop it and read it if they want to. But this is how someone did a test using a little robot. And in this little robot, you would think would just automatically always just not be impacted by consciousness, but in fact it very much was. And when chicks are born, they become very bonded to the first sort of thing that they see. And these little chicks were born, and the first thing they saw was this little green robot thing that could move itself around, and it had a little pencil and it would draw little pictures. And so it drew random pictures usually. But when they put the bonded chickens into a certain area, the robot would go closest to them, and all the pictures were in the corner where the little chicks were.
Just to speak to that, I mean, everything that we're talking about, I think that this is really important from this perspective as well as, the bad egg analogy. And then looking at that is because so often we do dim our light, we do dim our capacity for health and healing and radiance and all of these aspects because we feel impacted by maybe lower frequencies or lower thoughts around us, right? So we're letting that impact our light when really it's the opposite way around. When we really step into our own healing and our own radiance and our own purpose, it really is the vibrational shift that the entire world could shift with.
Yeah, that's beautifully said. So this is a tap water that sat next to spring water. The tap water improved and the spring water improved. So I think that when something has purpose, especially with water, water's natural purpose is to improve things. But I think what it gains by being able to do that is a sense of purpose. So here we are at hydroglyphs. So what is a hydroglyph? The simplified version is that they are symbols in ice that have one or more meanings. Now, we've covered this a bit already. Just as a quick recap, I use words as my inspiring influence. Again, water doesn't read words. It absorbs the energy of words and freezes into the energy of a word. So the picture you see there on the right is the crystallization of the energy of the word creation. Its secondary layer of meaning we've discovered means fire. Now, to say that I have one hydroglyph, I need to have seen the same symbol appear using the same word influence at least 50 times. Layered meaning, I need to have seen exactly the same thing. It's taken me 5 years, and I only have 40 hydroglyphs over 5 years. And yet I have a number of their layers of meaning. So it's such a lengthy process. But I think what we've learned is extremely interesting and extremely important. So there are 2 quotes at the bottom there that I really like. The first is, when the human race learns to read the language of symbolism, a great veil will fall from the eyes of men, by Manny Hall. And Carl Jung said that the man who speaks with primordial images speaks with 1,000 tongues. This is the energy of the word message. Now, it's very identifiable. There are 64 examples of it here. Now, it looks like a triangle with a frill around the edge and some very information-like looking patterns on the top of it. We've identified that at the tip, and I think there's another section on this that I'll get to, but the thing that's at the tip of them, some of them have hearts at the tip, and some of them are just like this, and some of them look a little different. But we've come to understand that the hearts, the ones that have hearts, means that it is a loving or emotional message. When it says other potential meanings, it means that I've used that word, seen the same symbol, but I haven't repeated it 50 times yet. The winter tree means change and winter. The empty circle means completion. Now, you're looking at 64 examples here. It's not just 1 or 2, right? You really get to see the consistency. Now, remembering they're very identifiable. The lotus ice image means enlightenment and purity. We've kind of covered this a little. The fern hexagon, this is what I kind of call this shape. It means a bunch of things. I've done a lot of work on this. So there's living, death, healthy, and gratitude. When you see one of these in a dish, usually it's meaning living. Depending on what your inspiring influence was, it can mean living and gratitude. But a man reached out who was given only a few months to live, and so asked me to ask water what death looked like. So I did. And I wrote the word death, but I kept seeing the living glyph, which I'd identified already. And I was quite confused because I was like, well, am I sure? Are you sure? And so I kept doing it. And after a bit of doing it more than 50 times, I realized that, of course, water doesn't die. Water sees the word death as a transition of life, as opposed to a physical death in the way that we understand death. So when I see this word death, I see it and know that it is simply like a transition from, say, a liquid to a vapor, or a solid to a liquid, or something like that.
So beautiful to understand. I don't see death as most people see death either. I think anyone that's been through different types of experiences in their life, and then also in communication with other dimensions and those who've passed, it's different, right? And our water carries all of this ancient wisdom. That in and of itself is just fascinating, that through the beginning of this plane, this earth, water has been here and present and holds and stores the memory of that. Of course, it doesn't understand death. Incredible.
And it's definitely trying to do its best to teach me that. And I'm doing my best to relay the message to the best of my ability. And I think that's all I can do, is to the best of my ability, I can share what I'm seeing water share with me and its meanings. This is a simple one. It means information, which there's bound to be a lot more to this than meets the eye, but this is what we know so far. Now, tips about tips. I mentioned this. When there is a heart at the end of the message glyph, here, like in these, then you begin to see, oh, okay, that is a emotional message. Now, down here, it's open at the tip. And we know that that means something else, but I need a lot of people to help me with this work. I make these discoveries, but for it to go further, I need help. That's why one of the reasons I'm so motivated to sharing my technique with people, so that people can help me, can start to understand all the deeper meanings of this and to the layers of meaning. So we might know so far the image for the message glyph, but somebody might use another word and see the message glyph, and we might like realize, oh, okay, this might be a layer of meaning now. So tell me what that is and let me go ahead and try that. So that happens a lot now, gratefully. When I asked water, what is a hydroglyph, it responded in hydroglyphs. And it was a living message.
Wow.
And I think that this is always a fun place to end, because there was a scientist, he was also a psychiatrist, by the name of Gennady Krokalev. He made a fascinating discovery based off on his own curiosity, because he worked with psychiatric patients for 20 years. And there were some of those patients that had terrible hallucinations. And he wanted to see if there was some way he could capture what they were seeing on camera, if that was even possible. I'd love to know what really made him kind of come up with this idea, but he wanted to photograph the retina of their eye as they were having a hallucination. So he got these goggles and took the lenses out and somehow attached the goggles to this box thing that came out of this old Zenith camera that he used. And when they were having a vision, he would take photos. And he did this with over 200 patients, and somewhere in the region of 100 and somewhere around 107, 117 of them could confirm that what the photos showed were in fact sort of what they were seeing. Now, his photos were really amazing, some very clear, almost like that can't be real, some more fuzzy, like you might imagine, because it was hard to imagine that the retina can create imagery to start with. So even imagining that is kind of hard. But this was then repeated by more Russian scientists within the last, I think, 15 years. They put a documentary about it together, because rather than using psychiatric patients, they used someone who could remote view, and the scientists stood behind a wall and held up numbers and shapes. And as she tuned into the number or the shape, they would take the photo of her retina and they saw the images. So here are some pictures.
Wow.
It's actually extremely hard to find any of Gennady Krokalev's images. They seem very well hidden. Top left, you see him and how he had set it up. It's kind of hard to imagine until you physically see how he set it up. Now, the
Like an
picture
actual
below,
camera attached to someone's face for everyone
yeah,
just listening in.
yeah. And then you can see these kind of images, and some of them are a little darker. You can certainly see the face, you can see the car, and some it's like a kind of tree, and it's all kind of written in Russian there. One looks like a definite Loch Ness monster. Over here, this is the more new one. You can see that they used a scuba diving mask without the lens instead and attached it to the camera. And you can see there she's projected the triangle and the number 1. And so the hypothesis of this was twofold. Most people go with the second. The first is that there may be a secondary consciousness, like another realm that is being photographed. And certainly, if you think about the sensitivity of film and cameras pick up orbs quite often. We're not seeing them necessarily. And animals can see things that we can't see, and they can be watching things we can't see. So it's very possible that there is something else. The other one, which the science world tends to go with more, is that the brain collects information and sends that information to the retina. The retina rearranges that information into picture form and projects it out like a holograph. Now, that is what's being captured on camera. I think that's really interesting.
That's very, very
Because
interesting.
the secret for this particular work seems to be having something held in your mind's eye very clearly. And whereas my work, water's just picking up stuff all around it. It's, I don't have to concentrate on what I'm doing. In fact, the more I get out of my mind and just kind of be in a heart-centered space, the more water is responsive. So I find it really interesting, though, because I'm often looking for references, things that we can kind of identify as being somewhat similar. And I interviewed a friend of mine, Venice McNeil, her and her husband were the directors of a series called Magical Egypt. And they were saying that the ancient Egyptians knew very well all about DMT. And there is a huge amount of DMT in the retina of the eye. And she said, actually, it's proposed that this concept of our seeing the world is seen through a DMT lens, which I think is kind of like an idea that's very interesting. So
very interesting.
that's the end of the presentation that I have. There's so much to share.
If you could share about your book with us, that would be great.
The thing about sharing the book is that I'm writing it. There's so many people every day who are like, where can I get your book? I did have a book out. They're not in publication any longer. In fact, and I'm just going to say this because I think it's kind of, I don't know how, I don't feel good about it. There's somebody apparently trying to sell my book secondhand for like $450. And people have been emailing me saying, there's only one book available and it's this guy's trying, or whoever is trying to sell it for that much money. Because I've done so much work since I published that book, I've been working on this new one. And it covers, the first one was like a gallery of my work. But in the few years since then, I have literally kind of exponentially, my work has exploded in every direction. And so there is a bunch more photos. There's a bunch more writing talking about everything we've talked about and more. And at the end, which wasn't in my last book, there is a very detailed step-by-step guide as to how to do my technique. And so it's going to be a very practical book too. Now, I hope to have this finished by July. It'll be either out this year or next year, one way or another. But it's going to be called the same name, The Secret Intelligence of Water. But I'm very, very proud of what I've been working on so far.
It's just incredible all that you've been able to uncover within this discovery in this time. And it feels like water chose you. You chose water as the tool for exploring new language and going deeper into the mysteries of the universe. So thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and this incredible work and your journey of discovery within the work. It's been it's fascinating. We have so many questions. Everyone reach out, and connect with us. I have so many questions, like I'm going to go and ponder after we get off the call here. But thank you so much. And it will be such a joy to get to watch this unfold as you continue forward.
Well, thank you so much. And reach out to me because I'd like to talk to you more about your near-death experience too.
Yes, I have much to share with you on all of those things.